the door. Yeah.
Okay, happy Friday. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got a few things we want to go over today, and then we'll be dedicating a good chunk of time toward working with your partner or group of three. If your partner or group of three is not here, you'll have some time to work, prepare on your own and message your partner too. And we'll dedicate kind of a large block for the end of class where you're welcome to work with your partner as long as you'd like. And then, it's Friday. If you're wanting to head out sooner and you've completed all that you need to do, you're welcome to do that too. So as we're getting started, we took some time last class to talk about these survey interviews. Again, I think people did really well across the board. I'd say the average grade was in the B minus A plus range, or a B minus to A minus range, which was really good. So I enjoyed getting to see you all do that. We also talked about the recruitment interviews and the strategies of preparation. So you're going to hear kind of the both recruitment and employment style interviews. And fundamentally, those two things are very similar and get used interchangeably a lot. So if you're thinking about a recruitment interview, right, a recruitment interview is taking the perspective of the employer, right? What is the employer looking for and what are the strategies that they're using to recruit and to field candidates that they believe are a good fit for the position? Meanwhile, if we think about it as an employment interview perspective, that is how a potential employee or applicant for a job is marketing, promoting themselves, and preparing for the position, right? So as you think about the employment interview assignment for the class, you're going to be graded both on your role as an interviewer, how are you screening, asking good questions, and trying to figure out if the candidate is a good fit on the recruitment end, and how as an employee, potential employee for the job, are you marketing, promoting yourself, speaking to your strengths, and engaging well that show that you're a good fit for the position. So when you hear the difference between recruitment and employment, that's kind of what that's getting at, the role as either interviewer or interviewer, right? Recruitment gets used in a lot of contexts about people who are trying to seek out and find qualified applicants to the job too. For instance, maybe there's a dire need for somebody and you're interviewing someone who's not sure if they really want the job, but you're trying to sell the job to them. So today, I want to go over a few things that we didn't have quite as much time to talk about last class. We'll also be talking about some best practices, some tips and tricks, and ways to prepare effectively for employment interviews. In particular, how you, as an interviewee preparing for a variety of professional interviews, can ask questions effectively, because that's a really important skill if you're applying for various positions, and you'll have time to work in partnership. So I'm not going to go over this again, but just to remind, if you were not here on Wednesday, that your grades and feedback on the first interviews are posted. And I went over some general points about what went well and things to continue to work on, particularly use follow-ups and probes, but some really good use of framing the interview. And again, the framing stage is important for this next round of interviews too. Remember that the interviews are starting on May 12th, and they'll go again for 4 days. If you are in the group of three, it'll be just like the last group of three, where you'll have kind of a cycle with 3 interviews total. So like A interview B, B interview C, and C interview D. So you'll want to confer within your group of 3 as to who will want to interview who. We also took some time to talk about some of the ways that as an employer or recruiter, you can develop a set of good questions, right? The big thing to emphasize here is that you want to ask questions of the potential employee that, first of all, are things that would probably be really good to know later, right? Because if you recruit somebody who's really good, you find that they're a great fit, that's awesome, right? You save a ton of time and money. But if there's somebody where there are a lot of red flags about their behavior, they're not a good employee, they're not a good fit for the job, right? That costs a whole lot of time, a whole lot of money. You think about the amount of time it takes to train somebody, to acclimate and prepare somebody, the gap that comes if they depart or get fired, right? So generally speaking, on the part of an employer or recruiter, you really want to find a good fit, because if you don't, that's going to be a really big hit on your group organization. So you should also be looking for and asking questions that are not things that are easily available in a resume or CV or portfolio. You're not being asked to submit any of those things for this interview assignment. But as you're working with your partner, you might discuss the kinds of things that you would prepare and likely present if you were applying, right? So for instance, something like a cover letter or resume that you might use. So some of the kinds of questions that work really well, right, as mentioned, might include an inter-test, that is, testing somebody's knowledge of a topic or issue as they're getting into as they're getting into the interview process. For example, asking somebody a question about what their company does is a really good way to make sure that the interviewee understands and knows what it is that they're interviewing for, right? In the past, I've posted and I have fielded candidates for a job, and sometimes a candidate says, "Oh, I think this is a great fit for me," but it's a faculty position and they don't have any teaching experience. So, making sure that we understand how the job aligns with your experience is important. Non-traditional and behavior-based questions, right? Those are things that might spark the interests, the values, the beliefs of the interviewee. In particular, a non-traditional question can oftentimes be used to get somebody off script, because oftentimes if you are giving an interview, you have a lot of prepared things to say. You don't want to come across as canned or artificial, right? People want to see you, or if you're presenting and kind of embellishing yourself a little bit, they still want to feel like you're in there, right? You have a professional face or way you're presenting yourself, but you still want to be you. So non-traditional question is a great way to break out of that. For example, somebody asked my partner when she was interviewing for a job, "What's your favorite TV show?" And she responded really well, and they had a fun conversation about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So sometimes, like, asking a fun, out of left field question is a great way to see somebody's character and response. If they're asking a fun question and response is, "What does this have to do with the job?" Right? They're probably kind of uptight and maybe not the best fit. Behavior-based, right, is talking about the various qualifications and actions that somebody would engage in, right? So a really important element of interviewing people is understanding how somebody will act once they have the job. I see a bunch of TikToks where it's like somebody's interviewing and they say, "Oh, I'm a great people person. I'm really great. I love to work in teams and I love to collaborate." That flashes forward to them having the job and they're just like angry because they get an email notification. They're like, "Who's bothering?" Right? So sometimes there's a discrepancy between how somebody presents in an interview and how they behave once they have the job. So behavior-based question, how you address or deal with a topic or issue is important. Critical incident, again, are really important, like in the healthcare field, right? If there is an emergency or problem facing a patient, what you do. And hypothetical, kind of asking in a what if scenario. So when I interviewed for EOU, I was asked, if you had the opportunity to create your own course, what would it be? I talked about communicating health and science. And so like presenting people with a scenario can be really good. So we also took a little bit of time, and I want to speak a bit more to some of the ways that you can effectively answer questions in interviews, right? Because generally speaking, you're going to have a bit more open-ended responses to interview questions. And generally speaking, it's a good idea to have longer responses. One of the biggest things that employers are going to look at is the quality of your responses to questions and the amount of content and relevant material that you put into those responses, right? So if you've taken a class in public speaking with me, I'm a big fan of the preview and review format. So using a framing sentence to kind of outline the main point or main points that you want to convey in your response. Tell me what you're going to tell me, right? Provide a preview that flags clearly what you're going to cover. Provide the content and tell me what you told me, right? Review the content that you shared in your interview response. So for example, if somebody asks you in an interview to talk about your educational experience, perhaps you say, well, I come in with a lot of education experience. I want to talk to you about both my communication studies major as well as my anthropology sociology minor and how those two things would connect to this position. Take some time to talk about both of those and say, coming in as somebody with both Anth Soc and communications background, I think I would be a good fit, right? So reminding people is important. Recency bias and recency effect, right? People are more likely to remember the very beginning and very end of what you have to say. So play to that as people are interviewing you. And remember, people are probably interviewing a number of candidates. So what is the thing that's standing out and is memorable about you? That's what this is helping you to do. The STAR method, right? Situation, task, action, result. This is really good when you're asked to describe a scenario or explain kind of a tangible issue. So for instance, you're asked to explain how you dealt with a major problem or issue. What were the steps that you took to address that issue, right? So for example, you might say, well, when I was working at my previous job, there was this situation where somebody abruptly quit. This meant that we were tasked with taking on more shifts, which I was able to do. I was also able to take action by helping to create a new job application. And as a result, we have a great new employee, right? So showing us how you resolve the issue. And then similarly, PAR, what's the issue that you were asked to deal with? What was it that you did and what happened? So if you're asked to describe your previous experience, you might say, yeah, well, I volunteered for a summer camp about kids' traffic safety. In this camp, we did a bunch of fun things like putting on a puppet show and helping to chaperone children while teaching them about traffic safety. And the camp was a success. The parents were very happy, and we felt that the kids learned a lot, right? So using that to help set up too is important. So when we think about employment interviews, kind of getting into some of the new stuff for today, the big goal here in an employment interview is about selling yourself, right? And for a lot of us, it's not the most fun. Like a lot of us don't enjoy talking about ourselves or like creating something like a bio or a profile. It can feel a little bit weird. It can feel a little bit braggy. And you know, that makes sense. That's not how we normally communicate with people. But it's important not to sell yourself short, right? Coming across as confident, as qualified, those are important qualities that somebody's looking for. You don't want to dip into being arrogant, right? And taking on like responsibility or credit for things outside of it. But it's important to own up to what it is that you're good at and that you're doing well. Especially, right, if you're a college student, and again, I was in a very similar boat where you might not feel like you have the level of experience or training for a type of job that you're applying for. You think to yourself, there might be people way more qualified than me, right? Instead of thinking about that and worrying about who you're up against, think about it in terms of you. What is it that you would bring? And a lot of times there are opportunities where people are more willing to hire kind of younger or less experienced person because they see a lot of growth and they see a lot of potential in them. So, you know, don't sell yourself short if you feel like you're not coming in with the most qualifications for the position. What makes you a good fit? And what do you want to make sure the employer knows about you, right? So being a good fit is incredibly important. Whenever you're applying to a job, in your application materials, you should include the language of the job application. So for example, if the job application says you need to show competency with word processing programs. Maybe in your resume or cover letter, you explain your competency with word processing. So in an effort to try to make a lot of screening and interviewing of candidates more objective, sometimes they'll use scale and measurement to evaluate candidates. And one way that candidates are evaluated is just based off of the degree to which they meet the qualifications for the job. So if they see that keyword and they see that you have that qualification, great. Or verbally sharing your qualifications for the job in the interview too. You might say, well, yes, I do actually have over 2 years of service experience. Let me tell you a little bit about it. And then as you're thinking about the job, right, there are a lot of things about you that you're sharing in the materials that you submit, like your cover letter, your portfolio, and so on. But there's a lot of things that people don't know about you, right? They don't know about some of your background or qualifications might not have fit into your resume, or it might not have matched the material they asked you to submit. So what are the things that fill in the gaps? What are the stories, the experiences, the character that you want to share that just can't easily be translated into submitting paper materials? Networking is also important, right? Networking, we can think of that as the major limbs or professional connections. Somebody like your advisor is a really good major limb that you can reach out to, or the department or major that you're working within. Minor limbs are kind of friends of friends, or people who are somewhat less close, but it might be people, for instance, you see that have similar positions to you that you added on LinkedIn. And then branches within that are going even further. They might be part of the professional organizations or groups that you find yourself a member of. For example, I'm in a number of groups related to the National Communication Association, which does a whole lot of advertising, job posting, and all that. So your goal is to present yourself in a successful and a prepared way. So for the interviews for this class, right, there is no grade, no impact on like physical appearance or clothing, right? Because I think it's kind of gross and kind of classist for me to like grade you based on your clothing in the class. So that's not a thing you have to worry about or think about in this class. But you're welcome to present yourself in a way that you feel like you would want to do for this class. But outside of the class, you want to think about preparing and kind of presenting yourself essentially a step up of what might be expected or what might be typically other people in like the interviewer are going to be dressing, right? So in other words, the interviewer is business casual, you go business formal. The interviewer is casual, you go business casual. Like a step up from the interviewer, whatever that looks like to you is generally considered a good practice going out and doing interviews after work. Another thing that I think is really important, and again, this connects more specifically to public speaking, but like if you're using Zoom or a similar platform for your meetings, it's really important to make sure that you've got a good space. For example, the use of a good kind of neutral background and lighting, presenting yourself in such a way that like your kind of spatial positioning is just right. I actually encourage a lot of people to like stand and prop themselves up if they're giving an interview over Zoom. That can be a good way to stand out. Another thing you might want to think about is just kind of reflection, lighting, pets coming in, people coming in. Like I asked like to block out a room if I do an interview. I like have a note outside the door and just check in advance and say, hey, I'm doing an interview right now. Please don't interrupt. And I actually have another pair of glasses that doesn't have the blue light and it doesn't reflect in the same way so that it can, when doing a Zoom meeting, not like distort the image or like make my eyes look weird. So there's things that you can do that can help you if you're giving that type of interview. If you're giving an interview over the phone, don't do it in the car, right? Find a place to do it where you can be really attentive. And one thing I like to do is if you're just doing a phone interview, like I like to dress up even though I'm not actually giving it in a visual way because it like mentally gets me in that headspace. Oftentimes in a phone interview, we're more likely to be casual and less detailed, and treating it the same way in that type of interview can be a really effective strategy. So what I'd like you to do is to take a little bit of time on your own, and this is part one of your attendance for today. Now that you've had the time to reflect a little bit about this assignment, what's the kind of job that you would want to apply for in this interview? Again, your interests might change a lot, but what's something that comes to mind as a type of position you would be interested in having this interview explore or practice? Secondarily, what are some strengths that you see yourself bringing as a candidate in terms of your experience that you might have, including courses that you've taken, jobs, internships, or other opportunities, and character qualities? What are the things about you that you feel like would be a really good fit? And then lastly, what are some weaknesses that you have as a candidate, right? We've all got them. It's important for us to be cognizant of them because those are things that we can address, we can reflect on, and we can be clear about in the interview process. For example, sometimes interviewers will directly ask, what are some of your weaknesses, or what would you say is your greatest flaw or weakness as a candidate? So being honest about that and owning up to that and your efforts to address that issue can be really useful. about 3 more minutes. Continue to think here. Go ahead and finish your current thought or sentence. And taking a moment to reflect and assess how you would bring yourself in as a candidate for an interview is really useful. Again, being honest about what you're bringing that you're good at, what you're not, and also seeing weaknesses and areas of growth as an opportunity. Sometimes employers are interested in somebody building skills and experience that are useful to them. So for instance, saying, I don't have a whole lot of experience with customer service, but I would love to gain that perspective, and here's how I would do that, right? Showing I don't have this experience, but I can explain what my approach would look like is a really good way to cover your bases on potential weaknesses or, areas that you have a little bit less background and experience with. So when it comes to preparing for any type of employment interview, one of the most important things to do here is to start by researching, right? Anytime you're going to interview for any kind of job, making sure that you're fully researched and understood what it is that you're interviewing for, and that you display that understanding before the interview begins is a really good idea. For example, if the organization, group, or employer you have has some type of website or social media presence, it's a really good idea to talk about the recent things that they've posted, they've shared, and they've addressed, right? So it might even be a new product, right? We recognize that, over at, Nels and Out, they have a brand new, they're doing brand new work to have sugar-free energy drinks. And maybe you're talking a little bit about that background, right? So whatever it is, there's something specific that you can show that you understand about the position, right? What is the position asking you to do? Looking at the job description carefully, what are the tasks that you would be asked to? And one way to parse this out is there's oftentimes a description, there's the minimum qualifications or skills, there's preferred qualifications or skills, depending upon the job. And you also want to make sure you understand everything that it's asking you to submit. You can also research in a more organizational context, right? So what are the professional networks or opportunities for circulating or talking about this? For example, we're hiring a new faculty member of communication, and we just posted today a job ad on National Communication Association listserv. A recruiter, right, or person who's seeking candidates is somebody you can look into as well. When I was on the academic job market, there would be like a search or hiring committee chair, right? And you would take the time to look at them, their profile and their background, and learn a little bit more about them so that you could kind of appeal to that person's background in your interview. But whatever boss, recruiter, or person you would be working with, it's generally somebody that you can learn a little bit more about ahead of time. Not in a creepy way, but in a, I recognize how I will professionally be involved with this person. And then current events and issues, including those that it might be facing, where you might want to work or be involved, I think are really good things to consider as well. When it comes to networking, we mentioned the networking tree, right? The branches, minor branches, and kind of ways that you can offshoot through that process. Again, this is a chance to think about how you want to kind of brand or market yourself in a professional way. You also want to think about this as assessing the honesty of applicants. So if somebody applies to a job, sometimes they're not supposed to, but there's a very good chance that people are going to look up that candidate on social media, right? You apply to a job, and then suddenly people are doing like Google searches of you, they're checking like a professional profile or page. They want to know like what comes up about you, right? So you want to make sure that what you're displaying and what that shows up about you, if they're searching you, is an accurate reflection. So one thing you can do is if you do something like a LinkedIn profile, make sure that that is representative of what you say that is true about you on your job application. You say you're honest, you're hardworking, and like the first thing that shows up as a social media result is like, a photo of you drinking beer underage, then that is likely a bad sign for employers. So social media activity, right? We know that it will kill jobs, and it will cause people who are employed to lose their jobs. Guardians of the Galaxy 3, James Gunn, all of that stuff is an example. Career centers and agencies, right? Groups and organizations that you can get in touch with. EOU has the Career Services Center, which is a great resource. We're doing mock interviews, we're doing outreach, we're helping you to kind of think about options here. But those things can be really good starting points for the interview process too. Again, I bring this all up in the context of preparing for and thinking about how to do these types of interviews effectively. Again, as we've mentioned, how you're perceived and how you represent yourself to an employer is important, right? So the branding or the type of thing that you want to make sure they remember about you, the same way like EOU, right? It's got the logo, it's got Mountaineers, right? There's a very specific brand for Oregon's World University. So what is it that is specific about you as a candidate that might make you a really good fit? For example, I come in with a really unique background. I'm somebody who has lived in both urban parts and the rural parts of the country. I understand how to bridge those gaps, et cetera, et cetera. You might come in with that type of background and talk about that experience. But what is the thing that you have that other people don't, right? You don't know who else is applying, but you do know what you do have, and you can speak to that in the interview process. So, if we're thinking about the application materials, one of the most common things that you'll submit is a resume, right? This is not a resume writing or business course, but it is useful for us to think about this in the context of the interview. The purpose of submitting your application materials is to land the interview, because oftentimes, while hiring committees, employers are going to look at your resume and maybe even look through it as they're interviewing applicants, which is something that's happened before. The goal here is that the resume is your doorway in. And insofar as it's incomplete and doesn't cover everything, because there's more you want to open up to. You want to open up the discussion through the actual interview. So the career focus and training is important here, right? You want to explain and include relevant experience to the job that an employer is using, and doing research goes both ways, right? It means that an employer who's interviewing somebody for a job has read through the resume in advance. The worst case scenario is that you as an employer have not read anything about the candidate and you're coming in, you don't have any knowledge about where the candidate's coming from. Because as you're able to dig into the background and experience of your candidate, you're able to ask questions that really get at these things, right? So sometimes there's infamous, why is there a gap in your employment here? Which of course is a problem for a lot of reasons, and that's presented as a question. But another type of question would be to say, okay, you were a sales associate. Can you tell me about some of the challenges that you encountered working as a sales associate? So oftentimes you want to start reverse chronological, where you start with your most recent and most relevant positions, work backwards from there. That again helps because a lot of people are looking over several applicants and it can be challenging to work through. You're probably missing things. So one thing that I really encourage you to start doing right now as a student is have a resume or like have a document that you just add to anytime something happens that you feel like would be a potentially relevant professional experience. Like have a Word document or like have a Google Doc and just have that like on your desktop, right? Anytime something happens that's remotely useful, add that in, add that line, right? Because if you're going in and you're preparing for a resume, you're going to forget a lot of the things that you've done that have been really cool. For example, maybe you did like a really cool summer institute or travel program that you totally forgot to include in your resume, but would have been a great fit. So also being honest, right? Explaining where gaps might be, explaining, yes, I was let go from this job, but I've learned a lot from that, and here's why, can be really useful too. So some tips here about doing the interview itself, right? One of them is to read the room. A really important element of the interview process is the role of nonverbal communication. Thinking about the nonverbal communication that the interviewer is using. Maybe they're skeptical, they're questioning, maybe they're affirming, kind of laughing along to certain points. That'll help you to emphasize where you should stop, where you should move around. If somebody's looking at the clock, might be that their interview time is running low. Shift to focus on different respondents. This is great when you are on any sort of panel for an interview, right? You have multiple people who are interviewing you for a job. Shift your eye contact, your gesturing, your focus onto those. One thing that's common is if you have a hiring committee, you have multiple people who are interviewing you, they're going to rotate between who asks questions. So you might speak specifically to the person asking the question and then speak and gesture more broadly to the group over the course of answering that question. Practice your responses. You can record them and hear how you sound when you're answering questions. But again, you don't want to sound canned. You do want to sound natural, but sounding natural involves preparation. And then show them who you are, not who they want you to be. In other words, show yourself as a candidate, and rather than having it be, I am transforming into a version of myself that is the employee, right? I am like changing who I am and how I behave. It's saying, no, this is me, and this is how I'm bridging myself or connecting to this position, right? So those are some things you can think about in terms of how you're verbally and non-verbally expressing yourself. Kind of finding a way to present yourself and present your experience in a way that connects specifically to the job, right? Last thing to think about here before I give you all some time in groups is to think about how you yourself prepare questions, right? So if you are an interviewee, if you are being asked questions for an employment interview, you should always come in for questions that you are ready to ask the employer. In fact, when you complete your interviewee brief, which is the material that you as an interviewee prepare, it's a great idea for you to include in that brief a set of questions that you want to ask the interviewer. The first thing that I would really encourage is to be careful about timing, because sometimes, depending on the interview structure, right, you are given, it's made very clear how much time you have and how many questions will be asked for, like, the amount of topics that are going to be covered. And one thing that I like to do is to try to modify the length of time in responding to those questions based off of the length of the interview, so that there's plenty of time for me to ask questions at the end. You can think about, like, in a longer interview, like say you're interviewing for, a very kind of high stakes job and you have like a 45-minute interview. You might dedicate 15 minutes of that to asking questions. So understanding how long the interview is, how much time you have, maybe it's not a time-sensitive interview, in which case you can ask a lot of questions. So understanding that in advance, like checking in ahead of the interview, or checking in like as the interview is being opened about the length of time the interview is really good. Again, this is a short interview, 6 to 8 minutes. So it's kind of a mini version where maybe you're focusing on just some key questions you as an employer are going to ask. But especially in a longer interview, modulate the pace of your responses to the amount of time that you think you'll have to ask questions to. Because if you don't have any questions or you don't have time to get to questions, oftentimes that leaves a worse impression. Questions are a chance for you as an interviewee to show your interest. Come with more questions than you have time to ask, right? So saying something like, I can't think of anything. I don't think I have any questions. Or saying something like, well, that was just my one question, right? Generally doesn't look as good as coming in with a number of questions that maybe you kind of list out in order of importance that you will be able to present. And those questions should not always be, what is your timeline? How much does this pay? They shouldn't just be logistical. They should be content as well. People really like to talk about themselves. They like to talk about what they do. They like to talk about the things that they're working on in their company or group or organization. So asking questions that get the interviewer excited can be a really good way to get a good impression. Don't ask questions you can easily access through something like a Google search. If it's information that's in the job description or easily accessible online, don't ask that. Generally speaking, salary and pay questions are things that you want to save for the negotiation phase. When you get an offer of employment, generally speaking, that's when you're having that discussion. Avoid questions that are about you and talking about you. Instead, talk about it in terms of what you might bring. So, for instance, to say, less about, well, here's what I have, here's what I can do. Say, you all have interest in this type of candidate, this is what I can do. Question pitfalls, again, yes, no questions. Do you offer health benefits, right? That is yes, no question that's generally very short and doesn't open up a conversation. Avoid have to questions. Again, those are questions that are really good in work phase. Do I have to go into the office, right? That is a common one for a lot of jobs. It might include a remote component. Don't ask those because they show kind of resistance on your part. Those, again, can be things that come in later. And then avoid typology, what type of program? Because again, that invites a very one-word response. Oh, we use Microsoft Word. Okay, great. Instead, tell me a bit about the programs that you use. And they might talk about how not only they use Word, but here's how they use Word and Notebook. So given that, in the remaining 10 minutes, I want you to take some time to work in your partnership. So if your partner's not here, you can work on your own and or message your partner to prepare for the employment interview. As your second part of attendance that you'll write on your own as you're working with your partner, think about at least 3 questions that you as a candidate could ask your employer during the interview. And then once you've completed the attendance activity and you feel good working with your partner, you're welcome to stay up until 10:50, or if you're done early, you're welcome to head out early too. So take some time to work with your partner, and we'll have a little bit more time on Monday in preparation for these interviews too, for you to work in class. Otherwise, you might find some opportunities outside of class to work with your partner.
The other day. I was that is my oh, I found my yeah.
I'll leave your factory.
Yeah, I just thought I had to go fix it. It's like, I'll do that for you. I guess they figured like 2 months.
Yeah. In your cases. I had.
Yeah, so resume. Right?
Well, that's what I wrote on. But then for 1 year.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Questions up? Just.
Okay.
So for your attendance part 2, right, if you are the interviewee, right, if you are the person being interviewed for the job, what are questions you could ask the employer? Ask the person who is recruiting or interviewing you for the job.
Like the last. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. I didn't know how to word it.
I got it.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well,
I said
like, oh, God, I barely- Yeah. Like, I put the start at the lower end, and then just over there.
Yeah, it's pretty much all that. I kind of want to.
I don't know what's going on.
I was thinking about that. Like,
Or like this company.
I don't know. That's the one.
I don't know you guys.
Oh, yeah. I hate it.
Yeah.
I need to. Oh, that's all that I did. But yeah, that's the place. So we're. Yeah, now that's right. Yeah.
I might ask What's? See you on Wednesday. next
Yes.
week.
Yeah. About another minute of class time, but I don't teach again until 11. So if you and your partner want to use the room longer, you can up until 11.
Case 5. Here you go.
We're wrapping up. We talked a little bit about preparing for employment interviews. We'll have more time to do so on Monday. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those things. You're welcome to tap forward or email me, or if you want to continue using the space, you can until 11. Have a great weekend and see you all next week.
We're good. I got there.
Professor Mack.
Yeah, what's up?
So for the employee interview.
Uh-huh.
I'm a little bit confused because as the interviewer, am I supposed to research their preferred job that they're trying to get?
Yeah, so you're interviewing them for the job that they're interested in applying for and I'm doing a practice interview for. So, you know, whatever information they have to you about the position or things about the position you can look into to help you develop a set of questions, I think can work really well. So I think work with your partner about anything that they want you to know about the position and preparing for it, and then that'll help you to do that, right? You don't need to know like everything is there, but anything that can kind of add a little bit of context to your questions would be great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Following up, does that mean like you guys are gonna be interviewing like different jobs?
Yeah.
Like
So if you and your partner are interested in two different things, yeah, you can interview for two different things.